why you wouldn't last a day in Newgate Prison, and more. What if I told you that some of the most terrifying places in human history weren't battlefields or plague houses, but the very institutions designed to hold societies unwanted? What secrets lie behind the stone walls of history's most notorious prisons? What would it have been like to wake up in a cell where hundreds had suffered before you, where the very air seemed thick with desperation and despair? Tonight, we're going to unlock the heavy iron doors of history's most infamous jails. From the rat-infested corridors of London's Newgate Prison to the isolated horror of Devil's Island. We'll walk through their shadowy halls, breathe their stale air, and experience the daily terror that defined life behind bars across the centuries. Before we begin this journey through the darkest corners of human justice, I want to know where you're checking in from tonight. What time is it there? Are you settling in for sleep, or perhaps winding down after a long day? If you truly enjoy these explorations into history's forgotten corners, I'd appreciate a like and subscribe, but only if these stories genuinely speak to you. Our community of history lovers continues to grow, and each of you makes this journey more meaningful. Take a moment to make yourself comfortable. Perhaps turn the lights down low, maybe put on a fan for some gentle background noise. Tonight's journey might be dark, but you're safe here with us. And please, let me know in the comments what historical topic you'd like us to explore next, or simply check in and say hello. You're an important part of our growing community, and I'm grateful for your continued support as we uncover these buried chapters of human experience. Now, let's step back in time to 18th century London, where the very mention of one name could strike fear into the hearts of criminals and innocent alike. Newgate Prison, a name that would become synonymous with suffering, despair, and the absolute worst that humanity could inflict upon itself. Imagine, if you will, that you've just been sentenced to Newgate in the year 1750. Perhaps you've stolen a loaf of bread to feed your starving family, or maybe you've been falsely accused of a crime you didn't commit. The specifics don't matter now, because you're about to enter a world where justice and mercy are forgotten concepts, where survival depends not on innocence or guilt, but on your ability to endure conditions that would break most human spirits. The first thing that hits you isn't the sight of the prison, it's the smell. Even from several streets away, the stench of Newgate reaches your nostrils like a physical assault. It's a mixture of human waste, rotting food, unwashed bodies, and something else. Something indescribable that speaks of hopelessness itself. As you're dragged closer to those massive stone walls, the smell becomes overwhelming, causing you to gag and retch even before you've passed through the gates. The entrance to Newgate is deliberately imposing, designed to crush whatever spirit you might have left. Massive stone walls rise 40 feet into the London sky, topped with iron spikes that gleam dully in whatever weak sunlight manages to penetrate the perpetual smog that hangs over this part of the city. The gate itself is a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bands, guarded by men whose faces show no trace of compassion or humanity. These are not men who see you as a person. You are simply another body to be processed, catalogued, and forgotten. As the great door swings open with a groan that seems to echo from the very depths of hell itself, you get your first glimpse of the courtyard. What you see defies belief. Hundreds of people, if they can still be called people, crowd every available inch of space. Some are lying motionless on the filthy ground, whether from exhaustion, illness, or death, you cannot tell. Others press against the walls, their eyes wild with madness or dulled by despair. Children, some no older than 8 or 9, huddle together in corners, their faces already marked by the premature aging that comes from witnessing too much horror too young. The noise is overwhelming. Screams, moans, arguments, the clanking of chains, and underneath it all, a constant murmur of human misery that never stops, not even at night. The guards shove you forward, and you stumble across the uneven cobblestones, slippery with substances you don't want to identify. Your feet slip in puddles of filth, and you struggle to maintain your balance while your mind reels from the sensory assault. You're processed quickly and efficiently. Your few possessions are taken, catalogued, and you know you'll never see them again. Your name is written in a ledger by a clerk who doesn't bother to look at your face. You are no longer a person. You are now simply a number, an entry in a book, a mouth to feed and a body to house until death or release claims you. The guards explain the rules with the bored efficiency of men who have done this thousands of times before. Pay for everything: food, water, a place to sleep, even the right to remove your chains. Have no money. Then you'll discover just how creative human beings can be when it comes to finding new depths of suffering. You're led through a series of corridors that seem to have been designed by someone with an intimate knowledge of hell itself. The stone walls weep with condensation mixed with substances you try not to think about. The floor is slippery with filth that has accumulated over decades. Rats scurry boldly past your feet, fat and fearless, having long ago learned that humans in this place pose no threat to them. In fact, you quickly realize that the rats might be your main source of protein in the coming days, if you can catch them. The cell you're assigned to is a space roughly 12 feet by 8 feet, and you quickly discover that you'll be sharing this palatial accommodation with 15 other souls. The previous occupant of your sleeping space, a pile of moldy straw in the corner, appears to have died recently, judging by the smell and the stains on the wall behind where his head would have rested. No one has bothered to clean the space. That's not how things work in Newgate. You clean your own space, or you sleep in the filth of those who came before you. Your cellmates eye you with the calculating gaze of predators sizing up potential prey. In Newgate, new arrivals are either quickly absorbed into the existing power structure or become victims of it. The strongest prisoners, those who have survived longest, control access to the best sleeping spots, the meager food rations, and most importantly, access to the single bucket that serves as a toilet for the entire cell. That bucket, you quickly learn, is emptied once a week if you're lucky, once a month if you're not. The daily routine in Newgate is designed to break you systematically. You wake, if you can call the fitful unconsciousness you achieve between the screams, fights, and general chaos sleep, to the sound of chains rattling and guards shouting. There is no gentle awakening here, no moment of peaceful transition between sleep and wakefulness. You jolt awake to the harsh reality of your situation, and for just a moment, your mind tries to convince you that this is all a nightmare. Then the smell hits you again, and you remember where you are. Breakfast, if it arrives at all, consists of a thin gruel that tastes like dirty water with a few floating pieces of what might once have been vegetables. The bread that sometimes accompanies this feast is so hard that you risk breaking your teeth trying to bite into it. Most prisoners learn to soak it in the gruel until it's soft enough to swallow. The water, when it's available, comes from a well in the courtyard that also serves as the dumping ground for waste from the kitchens and infirmary. Drinking it is a choice between slow poisoning and death from thirst. The guards make their rounds with the casual brutality of men who have been broken by the system they serve. They carry clubs and whips, and they use them freely on anyone who shows the slightest sign of resistance or even excessive despair. In Newgate, there are crimes worse than whatever brought you here, and those crimes include showing weakness, asking for mercy, or failing to show proper deference to your captors. The work assignments, when they exist, are designed to be meaningless and soul-crushing. You might spend hours breaking rocks that serve no purpose, or picking apart old rope, fiber by fiber, until your fingers bleed. The work is not meant to be productive or rehabilitative. It exists solely to occupy your time and wear down whatever resistance you might still harbor. Some days there is no work at all, and you simply sit in your cell, listening to the sounds of human suffering echoing through the corridors, feeling your mind slowly unravel as the days blur into weeks and the weeks into months. The nights in Newgate are when the true horror reveals itself. In the darkness, when the guards retreat to their quarters and the prison is left largely unmonitored, the inmates are free to establish their own brutal hierarchy. The strong prey upon the weak with a creativity that speaks to the worst aspects of human nature. Violence, sexual assault, theft, and murder are not just common, they are the accepted currency of survival. You learn quickly that in Newgate there are no innocent victims, only those who are strong enough to become predators and those who are weak enough to remain prey. Disease spreads through Newgate like wildfire through dry kindling. Typhus, cholera, consumption, and dozens of other ailments that thrive in conditions of filth and overcrowding claim lives daily. The dead are not removed immediately. They remain with the living until the smell becomes absolutely unbearable, sometimes for days. You learn to sleep next to corpses, to eat your meager rations while stepping over bodies, to conduct conversations with men and women who might be dead by morning. The winters in Newgate are particularly brutal. The stone walls that keep you imprisoned also keep out any warmth that might make survival possible. There is no heating, no extra blankets, no accommodation for the fact that human beings need warmth to survive. You huddle together with your cellmates, sharing body heat with people you despise, because the alternative is freezing to death. Many prisoners don't survive their first winter, their bodies simply giving up when faced with cold that penetrates to the very marrow of their bones. Perhaps most devastating of all is the psychological torture of uncertainty. You don't know when your trial will be, if it will be at all. You don't know if your sentence will be transportation, hanging, or simply rotting in this place until you die of disease or despair. Some prisoners spend years in Newgate waiting for trials that never come, slowly going mad as hope dies and despair takes its place. Others are brought to trial only to discover that their supposed crime carries a death sentence, and their last weeks are spent in the condemned cells, listening to the construction of the gallows that will end their suffering. Yet somehow, impossibly, human beings adapt even to Newgate. You learn to sleep despite the noise, to eat despite the filth, to maintain some small corner of sanity despite the horror that surrounds you. You form alliances with other prisoners, not out of friendship or affection, but out of the cold calculation of survival. You learn which guards can be bribed and which ones will beat you for trying. You discover which prisoners can be trusted with your back and which ones will kill you for the rags you wear. You learn the intricate social structure that exists even in hell, the complex hierarchies based on the nature of your crime, the length of your sentence, your ability to pay for small privileges, and your willingness to participate in the casual brutality that keeps the system functioning. In Newgate, a man convicted of poaching might find himself serving a murderer simply because the murderer has been there longer and understands the unwritten rules that govern daily life. The children in Newgate represent perhaps the greatest tragedy of all. Boys and girls, some convicted of crimes as trivial as stealing apples or sleeping in doorways, are housed alongside hardened criminals and subjected to the same brutal conditions. They learn lessons in Newgate that no child should ever learn, and those who survive often emerge as predators themselves, having learned that in this world, compassion is a luxury that can get you killed. As months pass, if you survive that long, you begin to notice changes in yourself that go beyond the obvious physical deterioration. Your moral compass, once fixed and certain, begins to waver under the constant pressure of survival. You find yourself capable of actions you would have found unthinkable before your imprisonment. You learn to step over the sick and dying without feeling, to ignore cries for help, to participate in or at least tolerate brutality because intervention would mark you as weak and vulnerable. The financial exploitation within Newgate deserves special attention, as it reveals another layer of cruelty built into the system. Upon arrival, prisoners quickly learned that everything in Newgate had a price, and that price was deliberately set beyond the reach of most inmates. Want your chains removed? That will cost several shillings. Need a somewhat cleaner cell? The price increases exponentially. Desire protection from the more violent inmates? Prepare to pay a weekly fee that most free labourers couldn't afford on their legitimate wages. This system of fees created a grotesque economy within the prison walls, one that enriched the guards and turnkeys, while ensuring that poverty itself became an additional sentence layered on top of whatever crime had brought you to Newgate in the first place. The poorest prisoners, those who had stolen out of desperation or been convicted of debt-related crimes, found themselves in the worst conditions precisely because they lacked the means to buy their way into marginally better circumstances. The irony was not lost on observers that Newgate functioned essentially as a debtor's prison for all inmates, regardless of their original crimes. The turnkeys, those guards responsible for the day-to-day management of prisoners, were themselves trapped in a system that encouraged corruption. Paid minimal wages by the government, they were expected to supplement their income through the fee system, creating an incentive structure that guaranteed abuse. A compassionate turnkey who charged reasonable fees or showed mercy to impoverished prisoners would find himself unable to support his own family, while a brutal and greedy one could accumulate considerable wealth. The system didn't just permit corruption, it required it for its own functioning. Women in Newgate faced horrors that were distinct from, but no less terrible than those experienced by male prisoners. Housed in separate quarters that were nonetheless subject to the same overcrowding and filth. Female inmates dealt with the additional vulnerability that came from being at the mercy of male guards who faced no consequences for sexual assault. Pregnancy was common among female prisoners, not from conjugal visits, which were rarely permitted, but from rape by guards or forced prostitution within the prison itself. The treatment of pregnant women and mothers with infants in Newgate represents perhaps the nadir of the institution's inhumanity. Women gave birth in cells with no medical assistance, often surrounded by dozens of other prisoners in various stages of illness and despair. Infants born in Newgate had survival rates that would shock even the most hardened observers, with the majority dying before their first birthday from disease, malnutrition, or simple neglect. Those who survived their early months in prison often bore the physical and psychological scars of that experience for their entire lives. The public spectacle of executions at Tyburn added another dimension to Nagitsa's role in the machinery of justice. Prisoners condemned to death spent their final weeks in the condemned cells, special quarters within Newgate where they awaited their execution dates. These cells were marginally better than the common areas, not out of any compassion, but because the authorities wanted condemned prisoners to survive long enough to be executed publicly. A prisoner who died of disease before reaching the gallows robbed the public of their entertainment and the government of its opportunity to demonstrate the consequences of criminality. The journey from Newgate to Tyburn, a distance of about 2 miles, became a ritualized performance that attracted massive crowds and took on an almost carnival atmosphere. Condemned prisoners were loaded into carts and paraded through the streets, while crowds jeered, threw objects, or occasionally showed sympathy. The procession stopped at taverns along the route where prisoners were offered final drinks, creating scenes of dark comedy as men and women about to die consumed alcohol in futile attempts to dull their terror. The chaplain of Newgate, known as the Ordinary, played a peculiar role in this system, officially responsible for the spiritual welfare of condemned prisoners. The Ordinary also supplemented his income by publishing accounts of prisoners' final confessions and last words. This created a perverse incentive for the Ordinary to extract dramatic confessions and repentances, which he could then sell to a public hungry for tales of crime and punishment. Many condemned prisoners found themselves pressured to confess to crimes they hadn't committed or to perform repentance they didn't feel. Also, the Ordinary could produce more marketable copy. The architecture of Newgate itself was designed to inspire terror and communicate the power of the state over individual lives. The massive stone walls, the heavy iron gates, the narrow windows that let in barely any light, all combined to create a physical manifestation of oppression. Visitors to Newgate, and there were many, as viewing prisoners was considered entertainment for the upper classes, often commented on the building's deliberately intimidating design. The message was clear: enter these walls and abandon all hope of mercy or justice. Yet within this carefully designed hell, prisoners developed their own forms of resistance and community. Secret languages evolved, allowing inmates to communicate under the noses of guards. Networks of mutual support formed, with stronger prisoners sometimes protecting weaker ones, not out of altruism, but out of a recognition that survival required some degree of cooperation. Even in Newgate, where every instinct pushed towards selfishness and brutality, sparks of humanity occasionally flickered in the darkness. The few reformers who entered Newgate and emerged to tell their tales spoke of being permanently changed by what they witnessed. John Howard, whose surveys of British prisons in the 1770s would eventually lead to modest reforms, described Newgate as a place that challenged his faith in both human nature and divine justice. Elizabeth Fry, the Quaker reformer who would dedicate her life to improving conditions for female prisoners, reportedly wept uncontrollably after her first visit to Newgate's women's quarters in 1813, overcome by the scale of suffering she encountered. These reformers faced enormous resistance from a system that profited from the status quo, and from a public that largely believed prisoners deserved whatever suffering they received. The idea that criminals might be reformed rather than simply punished was considered dangerous radicalism by many, a threat to the social order that depended on clear distinctions between the righteous and the wicked. Newgate stood as a monument to that philosophy, a place where punishment was an end in itself rather than a means to any constructive purpose. This, then, is what it meant to be imprisoned in Newgate, to wake each day uncertain whether you would see another sunset, to go to sleep never sure whether you would wake up at all. In this place, justice was a forgotten concept, mercy was a sign of weakness, and hope was a luxury that could get you killed. You wouldn't last a day in Newgate, not because you lacked courage or strength, but because Newgate was designed to break the human spirit so completely that survival itself became a form of collaboration with evil. And yet, Newgate was just one example of humanity's capacity for institutionalized cruelty. Across the centuries and around the world, other prisons would achieve their own notorious reputations, each finding new ways to transform the simple concept of confinement into sophisticated engines of human suffering. The rise and fall of Jonathan Wild, London's thief-taker general. While the stone walls of Newgate held thousands of London's condemned, one man walked freely through the city's streets, wielding more power over the criminal underworld than any judge or magistrate. His name was Jonathan Wild, and his story reveals how the line between law enforcement and criminality could become so blurred that society itself became complicit in its own corruption. Jonathan Wild was born in 1683 in the small village of Wolverhampton, the son of a carpenter who had hoped his boy would follow in his footsteps and learn an honest trade. But from his earliest years, young Jonathan showed a cunning intelligence that seemed wasted on woodworking. He was quick with numbers, quicker with words, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to read people's weaknesses and desires. These talents, which might have made him a successful merchant or politician, would instead transform him into one of history's most successful criminal masterminds. Wild's path to infamy began inauspiciously enough. In his early 20s, he made his way to London, drawn like thousands of others by the promise of opportunity in the rapidly expanding city. But London in the early 1700s was a brutal place for those without connections or capital. Wild quickly discovered that honest work paid poorly and irregularly, while dishonest work required skills he hadn't yet developed. His first serious brush with the law came when he was arrested for debt, a common crime in an age when owing money could land you in prison as surely as theft or murder. It was during his 4-year imprisonment for debt that Wild received his true education, not in any formal sense, but in the complex social dynamics that governed London's criminal underworld. Prison in early 18th century London was not the isolated punishment it would later become. Debtors' prisons in particular functioned almost like communities, with their own economies, hierarchies, and social structures. Wild learned to navigate these systems with remarkable skill, quickly establishing himself as someone who could broker deals, settle disputes, and most importantly, profit from the misfortunes of others. Within the walls of the debtor's prison, Wild observed something that would fundamentally shape his future criminal enterprise. He noticed that the boundary between legitimate business and criminal activity was far more porous than society liked to pretend. Merchants who found themselves imprisoned for debt often maintained their business connections through intermediaries, conducting commerce from their cells. Moneylenders operated openly within the prison, charging usurious rates to desperate men who needed funds to secure their release. Wild recognized that the prison was not separate from London's economy, but rather an integral part of it, a place where normal rules were suspended and opportunity existed for those clever enough to exploit it. Wild also developed a sophisticated understanding of human psychology during his imprisonment. He watched men break under the pressure of confinement, observed how pride turned to desperation, and learned to identify the exact moment when someone's resistance crumbled and they became willing to compromise their principles. He studied the art of manipulation, learning to present himself as a friend and benefactor while systematically exploiting those who trusted him. These skills in reading and controlling people would become the foundation of his later success as both a crime boss and a supposed crime fighter. The network of contacts Wild established during his imprisonment proved invaluable after his release. He had befriended thieves, forgers, prostitutes, and con artists, learning the intricacies of their trades and the structures of London's criminal organizations. More importantly, he had also cultivated relationships with prison guards, bailiffs, and minor court officials, men who occupied the grey area between law enforcement and criminality. These connections gave Wild access to information from both sides of the legal divide, allowing him to position himself as a bridge between the criminal underworld and the forces of law and order. When Wild was finally released from debtor's prison in 1712, he emerged with a sophisticated understanding of how crime and law enforcement intersected in Georgian London. He had observed that the official mechanisms of justice were hopelessly corrupt and inefficient. creating opportunities for anyone clever enough to exploit the gaps in the system. More importantly, he had learned that the key to success lay not in avoiding the law, but in manipulating it for personal gain. Wilde's first legitimate business venture was as a bailiff, a position that allowed him to work both sides of the legal system. As a bailiff, he had the authority to arrest debtors and seize property, but he also had intimate knowledge of who owed money to whom and when they might be vulnerable to pressure. He quickly learned to supplement his official income by taking bribes from debtors who wanted to avoid arrest and from creditors who wanted their debts collected more aggressively than the law typically allowed. But Wilde's true genius lay in his recognition that London's growing crime problem represented not just a social challenge, but a business opportunity. The city's official law enforcement was laughably inadequate for a population approaching 500,000 people. The few dozen constables and watchmen responsible for maintaining order were underpaid, undertrained, and often corrupt themselves. Into this vacuum stepped Jonathan Wilde, with a scheme so audacious and so perfectly adapted to the realities of 18th century London that it would make him simultaneously the city's most celebrated crime fighter and its most successful criminal mastermind. Wilde's innovation was to position himself as a thief taker, a private citizen who specialized in recovering stolen property and bringing criminals to justice. On the surface, this appeared to be a public service, and indeed, Wilde marketed himself as a friend to honest citizens who had fallen victim to London's growing army of pickpockets, burglars, and highwaymen. He established an office in the Old Bailey, just steps from the courthouse where many of his victims would eventually be tried, and advertised his services in newspapers and broadsheets throughout the city. The reality of Wilde's operation was far more complex and infinitely more sinister. Rather than simply catching thieves after they had committed crimes, Wilde recruited and organized them before they struck. He established a network of accomplices that eventually included hundreds of pickpockets, burglars, highwaymen, and fencers spread throughout London and the surrounding countryside. These criminals worked under Wilde's direction, targeting victims he selected and stealing goods he wanted acquired. The brilliance of Wilde's scheme lay in what happened after the thefts were committed. Rather than selling the stolen goods through traditional criminal channels, Wilde would wait for the victims to discover their losses and offer rewards for the return of their property. He would then contact these victims directly, presenting himself as a thief-taker who would track down their stolen goods and was prepared to return them for a fee. This fee was always less than the offered reward, but more than the goods could have been sold for through criminal fences, making it profitable for everyone involved except the victim, who paid twice for the same property. To make this system work, Wilde needed to maintain relationships with both the criminal underworld and the forces of law and order. On the criminal side, he ruled through a combination of fear, manipulation, and calculated generosity. Thieves who worked within his system were protected from prosecution and given steady income from carefully planned crimes. Those who tried to work independently found themselves arrested, tried, and often executed, as Wilde used his connections with law enforcement to eliminate competition. Wilde's control over his criminal network extended to extraordinary levels of detail and surveillance. He maintained detailed records of every theft committed by his operatives, documenting not just what was stolen, but from whom, when, and under what circumstances. These records served multiple purposes. They allowed Wilde to track the productivity of his thieves and ensure they weren't holding back valuable items. They provided evidence he could use to blackmail subordinates who considered betraying him. And most importantly, they gave him the information necessary to return stolen goods to their rightful owners, while maintaining the fiction that he had tracked down independent criminals. Wilde also developed an elaborate system of codes and signals that allowed his network to operate with remarkable efficiency. Thieves use specific phrases and gestures to communicate information about potential targets, the location of stolen goods, and the movements of law enforcement. Safe houses and drop points were established throughout London, allowing stolen property to be moved quickly and efficiently through the city without detection. Wilde even employed lookouts and intelligence gatherers whose sole job was to monitor the activities of both criminals and law enforcement, providing him with advance warning of threats to his operation. The psychological control Wilde exercised over his subordinates was perhaps even more impressive than his organizational skills. He cultivated an image of near omniscience, convincing his operatives that he knew everything that happened in London's underworld, and that betrayal was impossible. This reputation was carefully maintained through a combination of genuine intelligence gathering and strategic displays of knowledge. When a thief attempted to work independently or hold back valuable goods, Wilde would confront them with detailed knowledge of their activities, making it seem as though he had supernatural awareness of their actions. Wilde's relationship with official law enforcement was equally complex and corrupting. He cultivated friendships with magistrates, judges, and prison officials through a combination of bribes, favors, and the genuine service he provided in clearing cases from their overcrowded dockets. When Wilde delivered a criminal for prosecution, he could provide detailed evidence of their crimes, often including stolen goods and witness testimony. This made him invaluable to a justice system that struggled to solve crimes through traditional investigation. The magistrates and judges who worked with Wilde found themselves in an increasingly compromised position. Initially, they may have viewed him simply as a useful informant who helped them fulfill their duties. But over time, they became dependent on Wilde's assistance to maintain their conviction rates and justify their positions. This dependency made them reluctant to examine too closely how Wilde obtained his information, or why his captured criminals so rarely implicated him in their testimony. Some officials undoubtedly suspected that Wilde was himself a criminal mastermind, but the convenience of having cases solved and criminals delivered to their courtrooms outweighed their concerns about the methods used to achieve these results. Wilde's public relations efforts were remarkably sophisticated for the early 18th century. He gave carefully staged interviews to newspaper writers, always presenting himself as a humble public servant motivated solely by concern for the victims of crime. He published pamphlets offering advice on crime prevention, positioning himself as an expert on criminal behavior, while carefully avoiding any suggestion that his expertise came from directing criminal activity himself. He even claimed to maintain a private prison where he held captured criminals until they could be turned over to authorities, a facility that actually served as a holding area for his own operatives when they needed to disappear temporarily from public view. The scope of Wilde's operation grew steadily throughout the 1710s and early 1720s. At its height, he controlled virtually every aspect of property crime in London and much of the surrounding area. His thieves operated according to carefully planned schedules, targeting specific victims whose property could be easily returned for substantial rewards. His fencers moved stolen goods that couldn't be returned through a network that stretched across England and into continental Europe. His informants kept him apprised of the activities of independent criminals who might threaten his monopoly. Wilde's public persona during these years was that of a devoted public servant who had dedicated his life to protecting honest citizens from the depredations of criminals. He gave interviews to newspapers, consulted with magistrates on criminal justice policy, and even published pamphlets offering advice on crime prevention. The irony that London's most celebrated crime fighter was also its most successful criminal mastermind was lost on a public desperate for anyone who seemed capable of bringing order to their increasingly chaotic city. The human cost of Wilde's operation was staggering. though it remained largely hidden from public view. The thieves who worked for him lived under constant threat of betrayal and execution. Wilde regularly sacrificed his own accomplices to maintain his credibility with law enforcement, sending men and women to the gallows when it served his purposes or when they became inconvenient. He was particularly ruthless with thieves who tried to leave his organization or who began working independently, using his network of informants and his connections with magistrates to ensure their capture and conviction. Wilde's control over London's criminal underworld was maintained through a system of surveillance and intimidation that would have impressed totalitarian regimes of later centuries. He knew the personal details of hundreds of criminals, their families, their associates, and their weaknesses. He used this information to manipulate and control them, threatening exposure not just to law enforcement, but to rival criminal groups who might seek revenge for past crimes. The psychological pressure of living under Wilde's scrutiny broke many of his subordinates, turning them into extensions of his will rather than independent actors. The beginning of Wilde's downfall came ironically from his greatest success. By the early 1720s, his operation had become so large and so profitable that it attracted attention from critics who began to question how one man could be so consistently successful at recovering stolen property. Some observers noted the suspicious timing of many thefts and recoveries, while others wondered why Wilde's captured criminals so rarely implicated him in their testimony. A few brave souls even suggested publicly that London's celebrated thief-taker might himself be a thief. Wilde's response to this criticism revealed both his arrogance and his fundamental misunderstanding of the political currents of his time. Rather than retreating from public view or moderating his activities, he became more brazen and more publicly visible. He began taking credit for capturing criminals who had been arrested by others, claiming rewards for recoveries he had not made, and most dangerously, openly boasting about his influence over the justice system. This hubris would prove to be his undoing. The specific crime that finally brought Wilde down was almost trivial compared to the scope of his overall operation. In 1724, he was arrested for helping a criminal named Blueskin Blake escape from prison, a relatively minor offense that would normally have been resolved with a fine or brief imprisonment. But by this time, Wilde had accumulated too many enemies and attracted too much scrutiny for such a simple resolution. Magistrates, who had once been his allies, now saw him as a liability, while criminals, who had once feared him, began to see opportunity in his vulnerability. The trial of Jonathan Wilde became one of the most sensational legal proceedings of the 18th century. For the first time, the full scope of his criminal empire was laid bare in public testimony. Former accomplices, many of whom Wilde had previously betrayed, lined up to testify against him. The evidence revealed not just individual crimes, but an entire alternative system of justice that had operated parallel to, and often in opposition to, the official legal system. Wilde had not simply been a criminal, he had been a criminal government, complete with its own laws, enforcement mechanisms, and courts. What made Wilde's trial particularly shocking to contemporary observers was the revelation of how completely he had corrupted the official justice system. Testimony revealed that magistrates had accepted bribes, that evidence had been manufactured or suppressed, and that the very officials responsible for upholding the law had become accomplices in its systematic violation. The trial forced London society to confront the uncomfortable reality that the man they had celebrated as their protector had actually been their greatest predator. Wilde's execution on May 24, 1725, drew one of the largest crowds in London's history. Tens of thousands of people lined the route from Newgate Prison to the gallows at Tyburn, many of them victims of his schemes who had come to witness his final moments. The irony was not lost on observers that Wilde made his final journey from the same prison where many of his victims had been held. Often in cells he had helped put them in. But Wilde's death did not end his influence on London's criminal justice system. His methods had revealed fundamental weaknesses in how society dealt with crime, weaknesses that would persist long after his execution. The idea that crime could be controlled through private enterprise rather than public institutions would continue to attract entrepreneurs throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. More troubling still was the precedent Wilde had set for the systematic corruption of law enforcement, showing how easily the machinery of justice could be turned to serve private rather than public interests. The legacy of Jonathan Wilde extends far beyond his own criminal career. His story illustrates how quickly the line between law and order can become blurred when institutions are weak and corruption is tolerated. In many ways, Wilde was not an aberration, but a logical product of a system that valued results over methods and order over justice. His success revealed that society's desire for security could make it complicit in its own exploitation, accepting criminal methods as long as they appeared to serve legitimate ends. The prisons that held Wilde's victims, including Newgate, where his own story ended, were themselves products of the same institutional failures that had allowed his criminal empire to flourish. Like Wilde himself, these institutions claimed to serve justice while actually perpetuating injustice, promising protection while delivering oppression. In the end, Jonathan Wilde and the notorious prisons of his era were different expressions of the same fundamental problem: the corruption of power by those entrusted to wield it for the common good. The mystery of the man in the iron mask, France's most enigmatic prisoner. In the shadow of Louis XIV's glittering palace at Versailles, where courtiers danced in halls of mirrors and the Sun King held absolute sway over the fate of millions, there existed a darkness that would haunt historians for centuries. Deep within the stone walls of France's most secure fortresses lived a prisoner whose identity was so dangerous, so potentially explosive, that it had to be hidden behind a mask of black velvet. For over 3 decades, this mysterious figure moved through the French prison system like a ghost, his face forever concealed, his name never spoken, his very existence a state secret that would outlive kings and empires. The mystery begins not with the prisoner himself, but with the elaborate precautions taken to ensure his anonymity. Unlike the thousands of other prisoners who filled French jails during the reign of the Sun King, this man was never processed through normal channels, never appeared in court records, and never had his crime officially documented. Instead, he moved through a shadow system of imprisonment that operated parallel to the regular judicial process, a system so secretive that even its existence was denied by those who administered it. The first confirmed sighting of our masked prisoner appears in the records of the fortress of Pegnerol in 1669, though whispers suggest he may have been in custody for several years before that date. Pegnerol, located in what is now northern Italy but was then part of the French frontier, served as one of Louis XIV's most secure political prisons. It was here that the state confined its most dangerous enemies, men whose continued existence posed threats not just to public order but to the very foundations of royal authority. The prisoner's arrival at Pignerol was orchestrated with extraordinary secrecy. He travelled in a closed carriage, his face already concealed behind what contemporary accounts describe as a mask of black velvet, not iron as later legends would claim. The carriage was escorted by a full company of the king's musketeers, an honor guard typically reserved for members of the royal family or foreign dignitaries of the highest rank. Yet this prisoner was being taken not to a palace but to a cell, not to freedom but to a captivity so complete that it would erase his very identity from the world. At Pignerol, the masked prisoner was placed under the direct supervision of Benin d'Auvergne de Saint-Mars, a career prison administrator whose loyalty to the crown was absolute and whose discretion was legendary. Saint-Mars received his instructions regarding this special prisoner not through normal administrative channels, but directly from Francois Michel Letellier, Marquis de Louvain, Louis XIV's Minister of War and one of the most powerful men in France. The very fact that such a high-ranking official involved himself in the details of a single prisoner's confinement speaks to the extraordinary importance placed on maintaining this man's anonymity. The relationship between Saint-Mars and his mysterious charge would become one of the strangest in the history of imprisonment. Over the course of more than 3 decades, the two men would develop a peculiar intimacy born of their shared secret. Saint-Mars was the only person permitted to see the prisoner's face, the only one who knew his true identity, and the only one who could communicate with him without the barrier of the mask. This knowledge bound them together in a way that transcended the normal relationship between jailer and prisoner, creating a connection that was part guardianship, part companionship, and part mutual imprisonment. Saint-Mars took his duties with obsessive seriousness, implementing security measures that went far beyond what was required for even the most dangerous criminals. He personally supervised every aspect of the masked prisoner's daily routine, from the preparation of his meals to the cleaning of his quarters. He insisted that all communication with the prisoner be conducted through him, and he personally read every book, letter, or document that entered or left the prisoner's possession. This level of personal involvement was extraordinary for a prison administrator and suggests that Saint-Mars understood that his own fate was inextricably linked to that of his mysterious charge. The conditions of the masked prisoner's confinement were unlike anything seen in the French prison system before or since. He was housed not in a dungeon, but in a specially prepared apartment within the fortress, complete with furnishings that would have been considered luxurious by the standards of most free citizens. He was served meals on silver plate, provided with fine clothing, and allowed access to books, writing materials, and musical instruments. Yet these comforts came with restrictions so severe that they transformed luxury into a uniquely refined form of torture. The prisoner was never allowed to show his face to anyone except Saint-Mars himself, and even then only when the two were completely alone. When servants entered his chambers, he was required to wear his velvet mask, a precaution that turned every human interaction into a reminder of his lost identity. He was forbidden from speaking his real name or making any reference to his past life, and any attempt to communicate information about his identity to others was punishable by immediate execution. Not just for him, but for anyone who received such information. The velvet mask itself became an object of fascination and speculation. Contemporary accounts describe it as being fashioned from black velvet with steel springs that held it firmly in place without the need for straps that might be uncomfortable during long wear. The mask covered the prisoner's entire face except for his mouth, allowing him to eat and speak while maintaining his anonymity. Some accounts suggest that the mask was lined with soft material to prevent chafing, indicating that it was designed for continuous, long-term wear. The very existence of such a carefully crafted device speaks to the permanence of the prisoner's situation and the resources the French state was willing to commit to maintaining his anonymity. Perhaps most remarkably, the masked prisoner was allowed to attend Mass in the fortress chapel, but only under conditions that must have seemed surreal to other worshippers. He sat in a specially constructed booth that concealed his masked face from view while allowing him to participate in the service. Guards flanked him at all times, and he was forbidden from speaking to the priest or making confession in any way that might reveal his identity. Even in seeking forgiveness from God, he was required to maintain the fiction of his anonymity The psychological impact of such prolonged anonymity can scarcely be imagined. To be stripped not just of freedom, but of identity itself. To exist as a living ghost whose very name had been erased from official memory represents a form of punishment that goes beyond mere physical confinement. The masked prisoner lived in a world where his past had been officially cancelled and his future reduced to an endless repetition of identical, anonymous days. He became, in effect, a non-person, existing in the physical world but erased from the social and political reality of his time. The few documented interactions between the masked prisoner and others reveal a man of considerable education and refinement who maintained his dignity despite circumstances designed to strip it away. When accidents or emergencies required other people to enter his presence, witnesses consistently described a man who spoke several languages fluently, demonstrated familiarity with court etiquette and diplomatic protocols, and carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority and respect. These observations only deepened the mystery of his identity, suggesting someone who had occupied a position of considerable importance before his imprisonment. As years passed at Pignerol, the mystery of the masked prisoner deepened rather than resolved. Other high-profile political prisoners came and went, serving their sentences or dying in captivity. But the masked man remained, a permanent fixture whose continued presence became part of the fortress's institutional memory. Guards whispered about him in corridors, speculating about crimes so terrible that they required such extraordinary punishment. But their speculation only added to the mythology surrounding his imprisonment. The prisoner's daily routine at Pignerol was carefully structured to maintain both his physical health and his isolation. He rose at a set hour each morning, dressed in the fine clothing provided to him, and ate a breakfast that would have been enviable by the standards of most French citizens. His days were spent in reading, writing, or playing musical instruments, activities that kept his mind occupied while requiring no interaction with others. He took exercise in a private courtyard where high walls and strategic positioning ensured that he could not be observed by other prisoners or fortress personnel. His evenings followed a similar pattern of solitary refinement, ending with a dinner that matched his breakfast in quality and a retirement to bed at a prescribed hour. The psychological strategies the prisoner employed to maintain his sanity during decades of such isolation remain largely unknown, but certain patterns emerge from the historical record. He maintained a regular routine, imposing structure on days that might otherwise have blurred into meaningless repetition. He engaged deeply with the books provided to him, many of which dealt with history, philosophy, and theology, subjects that allowed for intellectual engagement without requiring human interaction. He appears to have developed a meditation practice or similar mental discipline that helped him endure the unique pressures of his situation. In 1681, when St. Mars was transferred to the Fortress of Exiles, the masked prisoner moved with him, traveling once again in a closed carriage with his identity concealed and his escort appropriate for a person of the highest rank. This transfer established a pattern that would continue for the rest of the prisoner's life, as St. Mars and his mysterious charge moved together through the French prison system like a traveling secret, carrying their burden of hidden knowledge from fortress to fortress. The move to Exiles revealed another layer of the mystery surrounding the masked prisoner's identity. Unlike Pignerol, which housed many political prisoners, Exiles was a smaller, more isolated fortress where maintaining secrecy would be both easier and more necessary. The very fact that the authorities were willing to relocate such a carefully guarded secret suggests that the prisoners continued. Anonymity was considered more important than the considerable expense and risk involved in moving him. Contemporary accounts from Exiles describe the masked prisoner as a man of obvious education and refinement. despite the years of captivity that might have been expected to coarsen his manner and appearance. He spoke several languages fluently, demonstrated familiarity with court protocols and diplomatic practices, and maintained the bearing of someone accustomed to authority and respect. These observations only deepened the mystery of his identity, as they suggested someone who had moved in the highest circles of European society before his imprisonment. The prisoner's knowledge of state affairs, revealed through careful questioning by St. Mars, appeared to be both extensive and current, suggesting that he had been involved in significant political or military activities at the highest levels of government. Yet this knowledge also represented a danger, as it meant that his continued existence posed ongoing risks to state security. The authorities' decision to maintain his imprisonment rather than simply executing him suggests that there were compelling reasons to keep him alive, perhaps related to international diplomacy or internal French politics. The financial arrangements for the masked prisoner's upkeep provide additional clues to his importance. Records show that substantial sums were allocated for his maintenance, amounts that far exceeded what was typically spent on even high-ranking political prisoners. The quality of his food, clothing, and furnishings was consistently maintained at levels appropriate for minor nobility, suggesting that someone in the French government considered it important to preserve his health and dignity, even while denying him his freedom and identity. This paradox of luxurious imprisonment raises questions about the prisoner's original status and the nature of his relationship to those who ordered his confinement. In 1687, the masked prisoner made his third move, this time to the island fortress of Sainte Marguerite, located off the coast of what is now Cannes. This relocation marked a new phase in his captivity, as Sainte Marguerite was considered virtually escape-proof. Surrounded by waters patrolled by the French Navy and isolated from the mainland by currents that made unauthorized approaches nearly impossible, the decision to move him to such a secure location suggests that the authorities remained deeply concerned about the consequences of his escape or rescue. At Sainte Marguerite, the masked prisoner's quarters were expanded to include multiple rooms and a private garden where he could exercise while maintaining his anonymity. These improvements in his living conditions paradoxically emphasized the permanence of his captivity, as they suggested that the authorities expected him to remain imprisoned for the rest of his natural life. The investment in his comfort represented an acknowledgement that his confinement had become a long-term state obligation rather than a temporary security measure. The island setting of Sainte Marguerite also provided new opportunities for speculation about the prisoner's identity. Ships passing the island sometimes reported seeing a masked figure walking in the fortress gardens, leading to rumors that spread throughout the Mediterranean ports and eventually reached the courts of Europe. These sightings transformed the masked prisoner from a French state secret into an international mystery, as foreign diplomats and intelligence agents began their own investigations into his possible identity. Foreign governments took particular interest in the masked prisoner's case, seeing in it potential leverage against French diplomatic interests. Spanish, English, and Dutch intelligence services all attempted to identify the mysterious captive, hoping that knowledge of his identity might provide insights into French state secrets or create opportunities for political embarrassment. Some foreign courts even considered attempting a rescue, though the practical difficulties and diplomatic risks ultimately prevented such operations from being seriously pursued. The most significant development in the mystery occurred in 1698, when Saint Mars was appointed governor of the Bastille, the most famous fortress prison in France. Once again, the masked prisoner traveled with his keeper, making the journey to Paris in the same careful secrecy that had characterized all his previous moves. His arrival at the Bastille marked the beginning of the final chapter in his story, as he would spend his remaining years in the shadow of the royal palace, hidden in plain sight in the heart of the kingdom whose secrets he carried. At the Bastille, the masked prisoner was housed in the tower known as the Bertaudiere, in chambers that had previously held some of the most important political prisoners in French history. His quarters were furnished with even greater luxury than before, including tapestries, fine furniture, and an extensive library. Yet these comforts could not disguise the fact that he was now closer than ever to the center of power that had decreed his eternal anonymity, living within sight of the Louvre Palace where Louis XIV held court. The prisoner's final years at the Bastille were marked by declining health and increasing isolation, as age and decades of captivity took their inevitable toll. Saint Mars, now an elderly man himself, continued to supervise his charge with the same meticulous attention to secrecy that had characterized their relationship for over 30 years. The two men had become, in effect, prisoners of each other, bound together by shared knowledge that neither could reveal without destroying both their lives. On November 19, 1703, the mystery of the man in the iron mask came to an end with his death in his cell at the Bastille. Even in death, the precautions surrounding his identity continued. His body was buried immediately in the cemetery of St. Paul Parish under the name Marcaille, with no ceremony and no permanent marker to identify his grave. His personal effects were burned, his quarters thoroughly cleaned, and even the silver plate from which he had eaten was melted down to prevent any possibility that some clue to his identity might survive. The death of the masked prisoner did not end the mystery of his identity, but rather began a new phase in the legend that would captivate historians, novelists, and conspiracy theorists for centuries to come, without the constraints of state secrecy that had surrounded his living presence. Speculation about his identity exploded into a cottage industry of theories, each more elaborate and dramatic than the last. Some historians have suggested that the masked prisoner was Ercole Antonio Mattioli, an Italian diplomat who betrayed French military secrets and was captured in 1679. This theory has the advantage of prosplying both the timing of his imprisonment and the extraordinary secrecy surrounding his identity, as revealing his capture might have compromised ongoing French intelligence operations in Italy. Yet it fails to account for the luxury of his treatment or the obvious respect with which he was regarded by his captors. More dramatic theories have proposed that the prisoner was actually a twin brother of Louis XIV, hidden away to prevent a succession crisis, or even the real Louis XIV himself, imprisoned by a conspiracy that placed an impostor on the throne. These theories, while making for compelling fiction, lack any credible historical evidence and fail to explain how such an enormous deception could have been maintained for decades without discovery. The truth about the man in the iron mask may never be known with certainty, as the very effectiveness of the measures taken to conceal his identity makes definitive identification nearly impossible. What we do know is that his story reveals the extraordinary lengths to which absolute monarchy was willing to go to protect its secrets, transforming a single human being into a living symbol of state power's ability to erase inconvenient truths from history. In the end, perhaps the greatest mystery is not who the masked prisoner was, but what his treatment reveals about the nature of justice under absolute monarchy. His story demonstrates how easily the machinery of law and order could be perverted to serve political rather than legal ends, creating forms of punishment that went far beyond anything prescribed by formal judicial process. The man in the iron mask became, in effect, a ghost in the machine of royal justice, proof that in the age of absolute monarchy, even existence itself was subject to the will of the king. Life in Devil's Island, where the French Empire sent its unwanted and more. While European prisons like Newgate and the Bastille confined their inmates within the familiar boundaries of civilization, the French penal colony of Devil's Island represented something far more sinister. The deliberate exile of human beings to a place so remote and hostile that it served as a living tomb for those the Empire wished to forget. Located off the coast of French Guiana in South America, this triangular patch of volcanic rock, measuring barely 14 hectares, would become synonymous with suffering so complete that its very name became a metaphor for hopelessness itself. The decision to establish a penal colony in French Guiana was born from the intersection of imperial ambition and domestic necessity that characterized French colonial policy in the mid-19th century. France possessed vast territories in South America that remained largely undeveloped, while its domestic prisons groaned under the weight of increasing criminal populations and political dissidents. The solution, as conceived by Napoleon III's government in 1852, was elegantly simple. Transport France's unwanted population to its underdeveloped colonies, where they could serve their sentences while simultaneously providing the labor necessary for imperial expansion. The theory behind the penal colony system reflected the optimistic assumptions of 19th century European imperialism. Colonial administrators imagined that French criminals, once removed from the corrupting influences of urban poverty and placed in a tropical paradise, would be reformed through honest labor and the opportunity for redemption. They envisioned thriving agricultural communities where former convicts would establish farms, raise families, and gradually transform French Guiana into a productive colony that would rival the sugar islands of the Caribbean. These dreams bore no resemblance whatsoever to the nightmare that would actually unfold. The reality of this scheme proved far more complex and infinitely more brutal than its architects had imagined. French Guiana, despite its tropical abundance, was a landscape that seemed specifically designed to kill European settlers. The climate was oppressively humid, with temperatures that rarely dropped below 80 degrees Fahrenheit and humidity levels that made simple physical exertion a form of torture. The rainy season brought floods that turned the ground into a disease-breeding swamp, while the dry season created conditions that baked the earth into concrete hardness under a sun that offered no mercy. More dangerous than the climate were the diseases that thrived in this tropical environment. Yellow fever, malaria, typhoid and dysentery swept through the colony in waves, killing newcomers with ruthless efficiency. The indigenous diseases were joined by ailments brought by the prisoners themselves, creating a perfect storm of contagion that turned the penal colony into a vast outdoor laboratory for studying the limits of human endurance. Medical care, when it existed at all, was primitive and often counterproductive, as doctors trained in European conditions struggled to understand tropical diseases that defied conventional treatment. The medical facilities in French Guiana were grotesquely inadequate for the population they were meant to serve. The main hospital at Cayenne, the colonial capital, possessed fewer than 100 beds for a prison population that sometimes exceeded 10,000 men. The hospital itself was little better than the prison barracks, with poor ventilation, inadequate sanitation, and a chronic shortage of medicines and medical supplies. Doctors and nurses, many of whom were themselves prisoners granted special privileges in exchange for their services, worked under conditions that made effective treatment nearly impossible. The tropical diseases that ravaged the penal colony population followed predictable patterns that the authorities documented but seemed powerless to prevent. Yellow fever typically struck new arrivals within weeks of their disembarkation, killing between 20 and 40% of each transport ship's human cargo before they had even begun serving their sentences. Those who survived yellow fever faced malaria, which recurred cyclically and gradually wore down even the strongest constitutions. Dysentery was endemic, spread through contaminated water and food, slowly draining prisoners' strength until they lacked the energy to work or even eat. The prisoners who arrived in French Guiana came from every level of French society, though the majority were drawn from the urban poor whose crimes reflected the desperation of industrial poverty. Thieves, pickpockets, political dissidents, military deserters, and common criminals found themselves chained together in the holds of transport ships, beginning a journey that would strip away not just their freedom, but often their very humanity. The voyage itself was a form of punishment, as hundreds of men were packed into spaces designed for cargo, with minimal food, water, or sanitation facilities. The transport ships that carried prisoners to French Guiana were repurposed merchant vessels and naval ships whose holds had been hastily converted to accommodate human cargo. Prisoners were chained in tiers, with barely enough room to sit upright and no privacy whatsoever for personal needs. The voyage typically lasted 6 to 8 weeks, during which time prisoners endured conditions that rivaled the worst horrors of the transatlantic slave trade. Storms, disease, and simple neglect claimed lives on every voyage, with bodies typically being thrown overboard without ceremony or record. The arrival at French Guiana marked not the end of the prisoner's ordeal, but merely a transition to a different form of suffering. Those who survived the voyage were disembarked at Cayenne, where they underwent a cursory medical inspection designed more to identify those likely to die immediately than to provide any actual treatment. Prisoners were then classified according to their crimes, physical condition, and perceived usefulness to the colony, a process that would determine their fate for the duration of their sentences. Those sentenced to Devil's Island proper represented the most dangerous or politically sensitive prisoners in the entire system. The island served as a prison within a prison, reserved for those whose crimes against the state required the most complete isolation possible. Political prisoners, military officers convicted of treason, and criminals whose continued existence posed threats to public order found themselves confined to this rocky outcrop, where escape was virtually impossible and rescue was unthinkable. The physical environment of Devil's Island was hostile in ways that went beyond mere discomfort. The volcanic rock that formed the island's foundation radiated heat during the day, turning the surface into a griddle that made walking barefoot impossible and rendered metal tools too hot to handle. At night, the same rocks released their accumulated heat slowly, ensuring that temperatures remained uncomfortable even after sunset. The island's sparse vegetation provided little shade, and what trees existed were twisted and stunted by the constant wind that swept across the exposed promontory. The architecture of Devil's Island reflected the authorities' assumption that the natural environment would serve as the primary form of security. The buildings were simple structures, designed more to keep rain out than to provide comfort, with minimal attention paid to ventilation or sanitation. Cells were small, typically measuring no more than 8 feet by 6 feet, with a single barred window that emitted air, but also allowed mosquitoes and other insects free access. The floors were bare stone or packed earth, providing no insulation from the heat radiating from the volcanic rock below. The daily routine on Devil's Island was designed to break the spirit through monotony as much as hardship. Prisoners woke before dawn to the sound of bells that would regulate every moment of their remaining lives. The first order of business was roll call, conducted with military precision to ensure that no one had managed the impossible feat of escaping during the night. This was followed by a meager breakfast of thin coffee and bread that was often moldy before it reached the prisoners' hands. Work assignments on Devil's Island varied according to the authorities. Assessment of each prisoner's usefulness and dangerousness. The most trusted inmates might be assigned to food preparation or administrative duties, positions that offered small privileges but also made them targets of resentment from their fellow prisoners. Others found themselves engaged in pointless labor designed purely to occupy their time and exhaust their bodies, breaking rocks that served no construction purpose, digging holes that would immediately be filled in again, or clearing vegetation that would regrow within weeks. The most dreaded assignment was road construction, work that took prisoners into the interior of French Guiana, where they faced not only the usual dangers of tropical disease and exhaustion, but also the possibility of attack by indigenous groups who had learned to view all European colonizers as enemies. Road gangs worked under armed guard in conditions that combined the worst aspects of slavery with the additional psychological torture of knowing that their labor served to strengthen the very system that held them captive. The indigenous peoples of French Guiana maintained a complex and often hostile relationship with the penal colony. Some groups had been displaced by the expanding prison infrastructure and viewed the convicts and their guards as invaders deserving of resistance. Others had learned that escaped prisoners, desperate and often armed, posed threats to their communities and territories. A few indigenous groups established trading relationships with the colonial authorities, providing food and labor in exchange for manufactured goods, but these arrangements were always fragile and subject to disruption. The ecology of the region presented challenges that European colonizers had never anticipated. The tropical forest that surrounded the penal colony was dense and nearly impenetrable, filled with dangers that ranged from venomous snakes and spiders to jaguars and caimans. Plants that appeared edible often proved poisonous, while rivers that looked clear and inviting harbored parasites and bacteria that could cause debilitating illness. Prisoners who attempted escape into this environment faced odds that made survival almost impossible, even for those with knowledge of tropical conditions. Housing on Devil's Island reflected the authorities' fundamental misunderstanding of tropical construction and human needs. Barracks designed for European climates proved to be ovens in the Guianan heat, while attempts to create more appropriate shelter were hampered by lack of materials and expertise. Prisoners often slept on bare floors in buildings that offered no protection from insects, snakes, or the torrential rains that could last for days without interruption. The food provided to prisoners was barely adequate for survival, even when it arrived in good condition, which was rarely the case. Supplies had to be transported from France or from other French colonies, a journey that often took months and invariably resulted in spoilage. Rice and beans formed the staple diet, supplemented occasionally by salted meat that was usually rancid by the time it reached the prisoners' plates. Fresh vegetables and fruit, despite the tropical abundance that surrounded them, were luxuries reserved for guards and administrators. The authorities' failure to utilize local food sources represented one of the many paradoxes of the penal colony system. French Guiana's forests and waters teemed with potential food sources, from fish and game to countless varieties of fruits and vegetables that indigenous peoples had harvested for millennia. Yet the colonial administration insisted on importing European foods at enormous expense, partly from prejudice against local cuisine and partly from genuine ignorance about what was safe and nutritious. This policy ensured chronic malnutrition among the prisoner population, while simultaneously draining the colony's limited financial resources. Perhaps most psychologically devastating was the complete isolation from the outside world that Devil's Island represented. Mail, when it arrived at all, was heavily censored and often months old by the time prisoners received it. News from France filtered through slowly and was usually distorted by the time it reached the island. Many prisoners learned of the deaths of family members years after the fact, while others simply lost touch with the outside world entirely, becoming ghosts whose existence was known only to their fellow inmates and their captors. The censorship system employed by the colonial authorities was both arbitrary and comprehensive. Letters from prisoners were read by multiple officials before being approved for sending, a process that could take months and often resulted in correspondence being rejected entirely for reasons that were never explained. Letters to prisoners faced similar scrutiny, with authorities removing any content they deemed inappropriate, which, in practice, meant almost any reference to political events, economic conditions, or personal matters that might affect the prisoner's emotional state. The guard system on Devil's Island created its own peculiar form of social stratification that reflected the broader inequalities of French colonial society. French guards, drawn largely from the military, occupied the top of the hierarchy and lived in relative comfort with their families in housing that was luxurious compared to prisoner accommodations. Below them were guards recruited from other French colonies, men who understood tropical conditions but whose loyalty was often questionable. At the bottom were trusty prisoners who had been given authority over their fellows in exchange for small privileges and the constant threat of losing their favored status. This system created opportunities for corruption and abuse that exceeded even the notorious standards of metropolitan French prisons. Guards supplemented their modest salaries by selling privileges to prisoners who could pay for them: better food, lighter work assignments, protection from other inmates, or access to contraband goods. Those prisoners, without money or connections, found themselves at the mercy of both their captors and their fellow inmates, creating a hierarchy of suffering that ensured that even in hell, some suffered more than others. The contraband economy that flourished within the penal colony represented a shadow version of legitimate commerce, with its own supply chains, pricing structures, and enforcement mechanisms. Tobacco, alcohol, and drugs circulated among prisoners despite official prohibitions, smuggled in by corrupt guards or manufactured locally from available materials. Some prisoners became entrepreneurs, using whatever resources they could accumulate to establish small businesses that provided goods and services to their fellow inmates. These underground enterprises sometimes achieved remarkable sophistication with credit systems, partnerships, and even primitive forms of insurance. Escape attempts from Devil's Island were frequent despite their almost certain futility. The island's location made conventional escape virtually impossible, as it was surrounded by shark-infested waters and lay far from any inhabited mainland. Those who managed to reach the water-faced currents that could carry them out to sea or dash them against the rocky coastline. The few who succeeded in reaching the mainland of French Guiana found themselves in a landscape almost as hostile as the one they had left, facing indigenous groups, dangerous wildlife, and disease without supplies or knowledge of local conditions. The most famous escape attempt in the island's history was undertaken by Henry Charrière, whose memoir, Papillon, would later introduce the horrors of Devil's Island to a worldwide audience. Charrière's account, while disputed in some details by historians, captures the desperation that drove men to attempt what seemed impossible and the incredible resilience required to survive in conditions designed to kill. His eventual success in reaching freedom stands as one of the few documented cases of successful escape from the penal colony system. Charrière's escape involved years of planning, multiple failed attempts, and alliances with other prisoners and indigenous peoples who provided crucial assistance. His journey took him through the jungles of French Guiana, across treacherous rivers, and eventually to Venezuela, where he found sanctuary and eventually freedom. The fact that his escape required such extraordinary circumstances and assistance only underscores how impossible escape was for the vast majority of prisoners who never possessed his combination of determination, resourcefulness, and good fortune. The psychological effects of prolonged imprisonment on Devil's Island were documented by the few prisoners who survived to tell their stories. The combination of physical hardship, social isolation, and complete hopelessness created forms of mental illness that had rarely been observed in metropolitan prisons. Some prisoners retreated into catatonic states, becoming living corpses who performed their assigned tasks mechanically while their minds fled to places beyond the reach of their captors. Others developed elaborate fantasy lives, creating detailed alternate realities where they lived as free men in imagined worlds that bore no resemblance to their actual circumstances. Violence among prisoners was endemic, but took forms that reflected the unique pressures of their situation. Unlike metropolitan prisons, where violence often erupted suddenly and brutally, Devil's Island fostered more subtle forms of cruelty that reflected the prisoners' intimate knowledge of each other's weaknesses and fears. Psychological torture often proved more effective than physical violence in a place where everyone was already suffering from the effects of disease, malnutrition, and despair. The treatment of political prisoners on Devil's Island revealed the particular vindictiveness that characterized French colonial justice. Men convicted of crimes against the state were often subjected to additional punishments that went beyond their formal sentences. They were deliberately isolated from other prisoners, denied access to reading materials, and forbidden from discussing politics or current events. Some were kept in solitary confinement for years at a time, emerging as broken shadows of their former selves if they emerged at all. Alfred Dreyfus, perhaps the most famous political prisoner ever confined to Devil's Island, experienced a form of imprisonment that was designed to destroy not just his body but his mind and reputation. Convicted of treason on the basis of forged evidence and anti-Semitic prejudice, Dreyfus spent 4 years on the island under conditions of unprecedented isolation and surveillance. His eventual exoneration and return to France would expose the corruption and bigotry that characterized the entire penal colony system, but not before irreparable damage had been done to countless other prisoners whose cases never achieved international attention. The Dreyfus case brought international scrutiny to Devil's Island in ways that the French government found deeply embarrassing. Foreign newspapers published accounts of conditions in the penal colony, often exaggerated but containing enough truth to damage France's reputation as a civilized nation. Human rights advocates and religious organizations called for reforms or closure of the system. The French government responded with denials, cosmetic improvements, and increased secrecy. But the damage to France's international standing had been done. The economics of Devil's Island reflected the broader contradictions of French colonial policy in the 19th century. The penal colony was enormously expensive to maintain, requiring constant shipments of supplies, personnel, and equipment from metropolitan France. Yet it produced virtually nothing of value, as the harsh conditions made productive labor nearly impossible and the isolation made exporting goods economically unfeasible. The colony became, in effect, a massive financial drain that served no purpose other than satisfying the metropolitan French desire to rid themselves of unwanted populations. Cost analyses conducted by French administrators repeatedly demonstrated that maintaining prisoners in Devil's Island cost several times more than housing them in metropolitan prisons. But these findings were consistently ignored by policymakers who viewed the penal colony as serving purposes beyond mere financial efficiency. The symbolic value of exile, the perceived deterrent effect of the colony's notorious reputation, and the political convenience of removing troublesome individuals from French soil were considered to outweigh the enormous financial costs. The colonial administrators who oversaw Devil's Island faced their own unique challenges that often led to corruption and abuse of authority. Isolated from metropolitan oversight and facing constant pressure to reduce costs while maintaining security, many officials supplemented their incomes through schemes that exploited both prisoners and supplies intended for the colony. Some sold prisoner labor to private contractors, others diverted food and medical supplies for personal profit, and a few established elaborate smuggling operations that used the penal colony as a cover for illegal trade. The indigenous populations of French Guiana viewed the penal colony with a mixture of fear and opportunism that reflected their complex relationship with French colonial authority. Some groups established trading relationships with escaped prisoners, providing supplies and guidance in exchange for tools or weapons stolen from the colony. Others saw escaped prisoners as threats to their territorial integrity and actively cooperated with French authorities in recapturing them. These interactions created a shadow economy around the penal colony that complicated efforts at both security and administration. The gradual decline of Devil's Island as a penal colony began in the early 20th century as changing attitudes toward criminal justice and colonial administration made the system increasingly untenable. The enormous costs, the international embarrassment caused by exposures of conditions in the colony, and the general failure of the system to achieve any of its stated goals, led to calls for reform that would eventually result in its closure. The last prisoners were repatriated to France in 1953, ending nearly a century of systematic brutality that had claimed thousands of lives while accomplishing nothing of value. Today, Devil's Island stands as a monument to the capacity of supposedly civilized societies to create systems of punishment that exceed in their cruelty anything devised by the barbarians they claimed to surpass. The physical remnants of the penal colony, now maintained as a historical site, offer mute testimony to the suffering of men whose only crime, in many cases, was being born into poverty in an age when poverty itself was treated as a moral failing deserving of the harshest punishment imaginable. The legacy of Devil's Island extends far beyond its physical boundaries or historical time frame. It represents a cautionary tale about what happens when societies allow their desire for vengeance to override their commitment to justice, when the machinery of law enforcement becomes a tool for social control rather than public safety. In the end, Devil's Island succeeded only in demonstrating that the capacity for inhumanity exists not just among criminals, but among those who claim the authority to punish them. As we conclude this journey through the darkest corridors of human justice, from the rat-infested cells of Newgate to the sun-baked isolation of Devil's Island, we're reminded that the worst prisons in history were not aberrations or accidents, but deliberate creations of societies that chose cruelty over compassion, vengeance over rehabilitation. These institutions reveal not just the capacity for human suffering, but the institutional structures that made such suffering possible and, in the minds of their creators, necessary. The stories we've explored tonight serve as sobering reminders that the progress we often assume in human affairs is neither inevitable nor irreversible. The conditions that created these notorious prisons, the attitudes that justified them, and the systems that sustained them can emerge again whenever societies choose fear over understanding, punishment over prevention, and exile over integration. Thank you for joining me on this difficult but necessary exploration of humanity's capacity for institutionalized cruelty. These stories matter not because they satisfy our curiosity about the past, but because they illuminate dangers that remain present in our own time. Remember that justice is not something that simply exists, but something that must be actively created and constantly defended by people who refuse to accept that cruelty is an inevitable part of human society. Sleep well, knowing that the darkness we've explored tonight belongs to the past, but carrying with you the understanding that vigilance is the price of ensuring it stays there, until our next journey through history's hidden corners. This is your guide through the forgotten passages of human experience, reminding you that even in the darkest chapters of our past, there are lessons that can illuminate our path toward a more just future.